December 1944. A field hospital 15 kilometers behind the frozen Ardennes front line. The smell of disinfectant mixing with pine smoke from a failing stove. Into corner bandages stiffening in the cold air before nurses could finish unwrapping them. Schwester Anna Hofmann pressed air, palm against the frosted window watching another convoy of wounded arrive. 38 years old, 10 years nursing. 3 of them in this war. She had learned to sort men by the sound of their breathing. This convoy breathed wrong. Too steady. Too strong. "They're not ours," she said, to no one in particular. Her supervisor, Oberschwester Dietrich, appeared at her shoulder. "British, the SS brought them in 2 hours ago. We're to treat them." She paused, her voice dropping. "Orders say to keep them alive. Nothing more." Anna had heard the speeches, the radio broadcasts about the subhuman enemy, the weekly lectures about maintaining ideological purity even in medical care. Her brother had died at Stalingrad, and she had been told it was these men, these British and Americans, who prolonged the war, who prevented Germany's rightful victory. Alive, she repeated, but not comfortable. What Anna didn't know was that within 3 hours, her understanding of the enemy, of the war, of everything she'd been taught about who deserved mercy, would fracture like ice under spring sun. The first soldier they brought to her station couldn't have been more than 19. Face blackened with frostbite, both legs shattered below the knee. He was conscious. That was the worst part. His eyes followed her movements as she approached with the morphine she'd been rationed. 1 syringe for 12 men. She'd been taught to make them last, to let the enemy feel appropriate pain. The boy's lips moved. She leaned closer, expecting curses, expecting the propaganda's promised hatred. "Thank you," he whispered in broken German. "Thank you for not leaving us." Her hand froze on the morphine. In 3 years of war, no one had thanked her. Not the Wehrmacht soldiers bitter about their wounds. Not the SS officers who treated nurses like furniture. Not the civilians who saw her uniform and looked away. Those words were about to become the first crack in a wall of certainty. By nightfall, 37 enemy wounded would arrive at her hospital. By the next morning, Anna would have to decide whether to obey orders or obey something deeper than orders. And 6 months later, when American investigators came to document what happened in that hospital, her choice would be recorded in testimony so unusual it would be filed in a sealed archive, marked not as evidence of war crimes, but as evidence of something the military didn't have a category for. Evidence of humanity in a place it wasn't supposed to exist. But first, she had to survive the moment when Oberschwester Dietrich discovered what Anna had done with the extra morphine, and what the British sergeant had shared with Anna in exchange. Not military intelligence, not escape plans, a photograph. 4 men in British uniforms standing in a garden. The handwriting on the back. Mum's roses. Summer 42. "Before France, if I don't make it, tell her they were beautiful." Anna stared at the photograph. The roses looked exactly like the ones her mother had grown in Heidelberg. Before the war, before the bombs. How did men who grew roses become monsters? She whispered to the sleeping ward. What she couldn't know was that in field hospitals across Belgium, across France, across the collapsing front lines, other German nurses were asking the same question, and their answers would never make it into the official histories. This is the story of how mercy became treason, how kindness became evidence, how the simple act of seeing the enemy as human threatened to unravel everything the Third Reich had built its mythology upon. This is the story of what happened when propaganda collided with wounded men who said thank you. To understand Anna's shock at that simple thank you, we must go back to 1941, when the nursing corps received its first ideological training manual, Section 4, Paragraph 12. The preservation of enemy life serves the German people only insofar as it provides intelligence or labor. Unnecessary comfort encourages weakness in our own ranks. Frieda Blum, 42, head nurse in Hamburg, had read that paragraph aloud to her staff. She'd been nursing since the First War, since 1917, when she'd held dying men regardless of which uniform they wore. She'd been told this war was different. This war had a purpose beyond borders. This war was about civilization itself. We are not to forget who started this, she'd told her nurses, her voice steady. They bombed our children. They starve our cities. We treat them because we are civilized. They would not do the same. She believed it because she'd been shown the photographs. The German posts in Soviet camps. Skeletal. Frozen. The newsreels of German civilians in Ruba. The endless proof that the enemy was exactly what the Reich said it was. Inhuman. But what Frida and thousands of nurses like her didn't know was that the photographs had been curated, the evidence selected. The story engineered. In a Berlin office building, repurposed by the propaganda ministry, a woman named Claudia Reiner spent 40 hours a week reviewing field hospital reports. Her job was simple. Find evidence of enemy brutality. Suppress evidence of enemy humanity. Every week, reports came in. A British medic who'd shared his morphine with German wounded. An American pilot who'd asked about his crashed crewmate before asking about his own injuries. A French resistance fighter who'd sung 2 dying German soldiers in their own language. Claudia marked each report with a red stamp. Anecdotal. Not representative. Do not distribute. What was distributed instead were the photographs of Allied bombing raids, the testimonies from the Eastern Front, the carefully selected evidence that built a wall in every German nurse's mind. The enemy does not share. The enemy does not care. The enemy is not like us. By 1944, this wall was so solid that when Anna Hoffmann encountered a British soldier who thanked her, her first thought wasn't sympathy. It was suspicion. What did he want? What was he manipulating her to do? But this wall had crooks, small ones, hidden ones. In Stuttgart, a nurse named Elizabeth Krauss had been reprimanded in 1943 for giving extra blankets to Russian posts during a cold snap. They'll die anyway, her supervisor had said. Save the blankets for our men. Elizabeth had obeyed. 3 Russians died of exposure that night. She never forgot the sound of their teeth chattering, the way it stopped, the silence that followed. In Munich, Nurse Gertrude Weber had been assigned to a ward of British posts in early 1944. She'd been warned they would be difficult, violent, ungrateful. Instead, they'd organized their own care rotation. The less wounded helping, the more wounded, keeping the ward cleaner than the German soldiers managed. When she mentioned this to her supervisor, she was transferred. You're becoming sympathetic, she was told. Sympathy is a liability. These stories didn't connect. Nurses were transferred between stations to prevent relationships from forming, to prevent local knowledge from accumulating. The system was designed to keep mercy fragmented, to ensure that every act of humanity felt like an isolated rebellion rather than a pattern. What the Reich couldn't control was December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the collapse of careful planning. Suddenly, there weren't enough hospitals for the German wounded, let alone the captured British and Americans flooding in by the thousands. Suddenly, nurses who had been trained to provide minimal care to the enemy were responsible for whether they lived or died. Suddenly, the propagandist's promises collided with reality at the foot of a hospital bed. And in that collision, Anna Hoffmann held a photograph of roses and wondered whether the 19-year-old boy who grew them had really wanted this war any more than her brother had. This wasn't just about medical care. It was about the most dangerous question the Reich had spent 6 years preventing its people from asking. What if the enemy is just like us? And then, on December 18th, 1944, everything accelerated when an SS officer arrived at Anna's hospital with new orders written on Reich security letterhead. Orders that made Anna realize her kindness had been noticed, and that kindness, in this war, was documented as betrayal. The SS officer was young, 25 at most, face unmarked by combat, uniform to clean for the front line. He stood in the hospital's administrative office reading names from a clipboard. 7 nurses. Anna Hoffmann was 3rd on the list. Report. At 06:00 tomorrow. Full explanation of medical decisions regarding enemy prisoners. Bring all documentation. Her supervisor, Oberschwester Dietrich, had gone pale. These are decorated nurses, veterans. That's why they should know better. Anna walked back to the ward on numb feet. Documentation. Every morphine syringe was logged. Every bandage counted. They would know she'd given the British soldier two doses instead of one. They would ask why. What could she say? That he'd said thank you. That he'd shown her a photograph of roses. That for 3 seconds, she'd forgotten he was the enemy. The British sergeant watched her approach his bed. He'd been watching her all day with the calculating look of a man who'd survived by reading situations quickly. You're in trouble. It wasn't a question. Anna checked his bandages without meeting his eyes. The shrapnel wounds to his shoulder were healing cleanly. Better than they should, given the shortage of sulfa powder. She'd used extra. That would be in the documentation, too. Why did you show me that photograph? She asked quietly. Because you looked like you needed to remember something. Remember what? That we're all someone's son. Anna had been taught that the British were pragmatic, cold, that they fought for empire, not for belief, that their motivation was greed, not sacrifice. She'd never been told they were perceptive. She'd never been warned they could see straight through you. My brother died at Stalingrad, she said. Not sure why she said it. Not sure what she wanted him to understand. I'm sorry. Not he deserved it. Not that's war. Not the callousness she'd been promised. Just, I'm sorry. Anna left the ward and found Nurse Elizabeth, who'd been transferred from Stuttgart after the blanket incident. They spoke in the storage room, voices low. They're investigating kindness now, Anna said. They've always investigated kindness. They're just running out of time to hide it. Elizabeth pulled a letter from her pocket. It had arrived that morning from her cousin in Hamburg. The city's gone. The hospital, where Frida Bloom worked, everyone dead. British bombers. Not an accident. They knew it was a hospital. Anna took the letter with shaking hands. This was the proof. This was the evidence that the propaganda was right. The enemy did kill nurses. The enemy did target hospitals. The enemy was exactly what she'd been told. But then Elizabeth said they were sheltering SS officers there. The British knew. My cousin says the intelligence was accurate. They gave warning. The SS refused to evacuate. How does she know that? Because she was there. She survived. And she says the British pilot circled twice before dropping the bombs, like he was praying they'd leave. Anna stared at the letter, at evidence that contradicted itself. At an enemy who bombed hospitals but hesitated first. At an SS that used nurses as human shields but called it protection. At a war where both sides did unforgivable things for forgettable reasons. What are you going to tell them tomorrow? Elizabeth asked. The truth. Which truth? There are so many now. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. She walked the ward at 0300, checking the British wounded. The 19-year-old with frostbitten legs was crying quietly, trying not to wake the others. She sat beside him. It hurts. I'm thinking about my mother. Whether she knows yet. Whether they've told her I'm captured or dead. They'll tell her you're captured. Will they tell her I'm being treated? Or will they tell her I'm suffering? Anna had no answer. She didn't know what the British told their families. She'd never thought about it. In 3 years of war, she'd never once considered that the enemy had families who waited for letters, who feared telegrams, who prayed for news. I'll make sure you can write to her, Anna said, when you're stronger. The boy looked at her like she'd offered him morphine. You'd do that. My mother is waiting for letters from my brother. He's been dead 18 months. I keep forgetting to tell her. I think if I don't write it down, it won't be real. This wasn't protocol. This was treason. Sharing grief with the enemy. Acknowledging that loss felt the same in every language. The boy reached for her hand. She let him take it. I'm sorry about your brother. There it was again. That impossible sorry. At 0600, Anna reported to the administrative office. 6 other nurses were already there. They stood in a line like soldiers awaiting court-martial. The SS officer entered with a clipboard. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, a man in a Wehrmacht Medical Corps uniform. Not SS. Regular Army Older. Tired eyes. I'm Oberhaus Fischer. I'll be conducting this review. The SS officer's jaw tightened. The orders came from Reich security and I'm countermanding them. These nurses are under Medical Corps' authority. If you have concerns about their treatment protocols, you'll file them through proper channels. The SS officer left. The threat didn't. Oberst Fischer looked at the 7 nurses. You've been treating the enemy too well. Do you know why that's a problem? Silence. Because it's making our soldiers ask questions. Why do the British wounded heal faster than ours? Why do they complain less? Why do they thank you when our own men curse you? He let that sit. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to tell you that this war is ending. And when it does, the people investigating what happened will be wearing different uniforms. They'll ask what you did when you had power over helpless men. Choose your answer carefully. He left. The 7 nurses stood in the empty office, understanding flooding in. This wasn't a threat. This was a warning. This was a German officer preparing for defeat, telling them to document their mercy, to make sure the evidence survived. Because sometimes the only way to win is to lose on the right side of history. What Oberst Fischer understood, and what nurses like Anna were just beginning to realize, was that they were caught between 2 recording systems. One official, one secret, both designed to document what happened when ideology met reality at a hospital bed. The official system was simple. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps tracked morphine, bandages, surgical hours, survival rates. Every resource allocated to enemy prisoners was documented and justified as serving military intelligence or future labor needs. Mercy was acceptable only if it had strategic value, but there was another system. An invisible accounting. In November 1943, Wehrmacht legal advisors had quietly begun preparing for war crimes tribunals, not because they expected to lose, but because they understood that wars end, records persist, and someone always asks questions afterward. Optman Georg Richter, a lawyer before the war, had been assigned to the Medical Corps specifically to ensure documentation integrity. His job was to make certain that when the inevitable investigations came, the Wehrmacht could prove it had followed Geneva Convention protocols. The SS had no such concerns. They burned records. They transferred witnesses. They ensured that evidence of their medical experiments, their deliberate neglect, their punishment of prisoners through withheld care, would die with the regime. The Wehrmacht, more pragmatic, knew it would outlive the regime. So it documented mercy. Every time a nurse like Anna exceeded minimum care standards, a field report was filed. Not for punishment, for protection, for proof that not every German medical professional had abandoned humanity, while Anna had been terrified that her extra morphine doses would be evidence against her. Oberst Fischer had been carefully filing those doses as evidence for her, as proof that when a 19-year-old British soldier asked for help, a German nurse had answered. That documentation system would save 17 nurses from Allied war crimes investigations in 1945 and 1946. Their files would be pulled, their choices reviewed, and a British military prosecutor would write, exceeded care requirements despite Reich directives, recommend no charges. But in December 1944, Anna didn't know this. She only knew that keeping the British soldier alive felt like both the right thing and a dangerous thing, and she couldn't separate those feelings anymore. The scale of this hidden documentation was staggering. Across the German Medical Corps, hundreds of doctors and nurses were filing reports designed to survive the regime. They used careful language. Patient stabilization required additional resources. Not, I gave the enemy morphine because he was in pain. They wrote, enemy wounded, maintained hygiene standards beneficial to overall facility health. Not, I gave them soap because they deserve to be clean. They documented mercy in the language of military necessity because that was the only language that would survive. Hauptmann? Richter had 3 filing cabinets in a basement office in Frankfurt. Each contained personnel files for medical staff who'd treated enemy prisoners. Each file noted instances of extraordinary care, documented with dates, witnesses, outcomes. He called it institutional memory. His assistant called it insurance. In the chaos of 1944, no one called it what it was. Evidence that the system was preparing to betray the ideology it claimed to serve. Most surprising were the SS nurses who appeared in Richter's files. Not many. Perhaps 24 out of thousands. But they existed. Women who'd joined believing in racial purity and German supremacy, who'd been trained in the ideology of deserving and undeserving suffering, who'd encountered wounded enemies and couldn't maintain the distinction. One was Schwester Maria Seidel, assigned to a field hospital near Aachen in September 1944. She'd been SS Auxiliary Corps for 2 years. True believer, decorated for ideological reliability. Then, an American medic was brought to her ward. Both legs amputated after his vehicle hit a mine while evacuating German wounded. He'd been capturing German soldiers, not to imprison them, but to get them medical care. Maria filed a report requesting special accommodation for his service. The SS rejected it. She filed again. They transferred her. Hauptmann Richter intercepted her transfer orders and rerouted her to a Wehrmacht hospital, filed her original report in his cabinet, made sure someone would remember that an SS nurse had tried to honor an enemy medic. By late 1944, Richter's system was documenting approximately 40 acts of extraordinary mercy per week. These weren't dramatic rescues. They were small rebellions. Extra blankets, double morphine doses, letters permitted to families, wounds cleaned more carefully than necessary. Collectively, they represented a medical corps in quiet revolt against the ideology they'd been ordered to maintain. But this system had weaknesses. It required paperwork to survive chaos. It required filing cabinets to survive bombs. It required belief that someone, someday, would care about the difference between minimum care and merciful care. In February 1945, Richter's Frankfurt office took a direct hit during an Allied bombing raid. 2 of his 3 filing cabinets were destroyed. Approximately 800 personnel files documenting mercy toward prisoners were turned to ash. The nurses and doctors in those files never knew. They went on treating wounded enemies, believing their choices were being recorded, not knowing the evidence was already gone. But the 3rd cabinet survived, and in it, Anna Hoffman's file documented 14 instances of extraordinary care between December 1944 and March 1945. 14 times she'd chosen the patient over the protocol. 14 pieces of evidence that mercy had existed in a place specifically designed to eliminate it. That cabinet would eventually be transferred to American custody in July 1945. A translator would spend 3 weeks reviewing its contents, increasingly bewildered by what she was reading. They documented kindness. She'd ask her supervisor. The Germans documented their own nurses being kind to our soldiers. Some of them did. He'd reply. Some of them were preparing to be on the right side before they knew which side would win. The translator's name was Ruth Goldstein. She was Jewish. Her family had fled Germany in 1938, and she was the one who recommended Anna Hoffmann and 16 other nurses receive formal commendations from the Allied military government for doing what nurses are supposed to do, for remembering that the opposite of enemy isn't civilian. It's you. But first, Anna had to survive the winter of 1945, when the front collapsed, when the hospitals were overrun, when the question stopped being how much care is enough and became who lives when there's not enough care for everyone. By January 1945, Anna's hospital had been evacuated twice. They were now in a converted schoolhouse in Bavaria, 60 kilometers from any active front, but surrounded by the war's debris. Wounded from both sides arrived daily. The pretense of separate treatment had collapsed with the supply lines. There were 23 beds, 74 patients. Anna stopped counting nationalities. She started counting hours until each man died or recovered enough to move. The British sergeant with the rose photograph had been transferred out in December. He'd left Anna his mother's address. When this is over, he'd said, write to her. Tell her. I spoke about the roses. She'd understand that means I wasn't alone at the end. He hadn't been at the end. But Anna understood what he meant. No one wanted to die believing their enemy hated them. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was accumulative. Each moment where Proto said one thing and humanity said another. In early February, a young SS lieutenant arrived with orders to evaluate the hospital's loyalty profile. He was 22. Confident. Certain. He interviewed Anna in what had been the school principal's office. You've been treating enemy wounded for 3 months. Has this affected your commitment to the Reich? Anna looked at him. I'm committed to keeping people alive. Isn't that the point? The point is victory. Your job is to ensure German soldiers return to combat faster than enemy soldiers. Are you fulfilling that mission? There are no German soldiers here. The distinction is race. These distinctions don't blur, Schwester. They clarify under pressure. Anna thought about the American pilot 3 beds down who'd been shot down, protecting a bombing run against a ball-bearing factory. The factory that had been making shells that killed American soldiers. The pilot who'd known this, who'd still asked if the factory workers had been evacuated first. She thought about the German corporal who'd been captured by the British and treated well enough to survive pneumonia, who'd said, quietly, that he'd never believed the things they'd said about the enemy. That seeing mercy had made him ashamed of the things he'd done when he believed the propaganda. I think, Anna said carefully, that the war is showing us who we actually are, not who we thought we were. The SS lieutenant marked something in his notepad. Anna didn't ask what. 2 weeks later, she learned that 4 nurses from nearby hospitals had been arrested for ideological deviation. The charges were vague. The sentences weren't. Oberarzt Fischer called a meeting of all remaining medical staff. Some of you are going to survive this war, he said. Some of you are going to be asked to testify about what happened in these hospitals. When that day comes, remember that you are following medical ethics. Not Reich policy, medical ethics. He paused, looking at each of them. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have an exception clause for enemies. Some people forgot that. Make sure you're not one of them. Anna understood what he wasn't saying. Document everything. Make sure the mercy survives even if we don't. That night, she started a journal. Not a medical log. A personal record. Names of patients who'd thanked her. Moments where she'd chosen care over a protocol. Evidence that she'd seen them as human. She hid it in the lining of her medical bag. Hoped it would matter someday. The cost of this transformation was measured in smaller currencies. Reputation among the true believers. Safety among the ideologically certain. Trust from the system she'd been raised to serve. But the gain was harder to quantify. How do you measure the value of looking at yourself in a mirror and recognizing the person looking back? In early March, an American fighter pilot was brought in with severe burns. He'd been shot down over Munich. The pilot who shot him down had been killed when the fighter pilot's crew returned fire. The American knew this, had seen it happen, was being treated by nurses who served the same military that had just killed his killer. I'm sorry about your pilot, he told Anna while she changed his bandages. He wasn't mine. That makes him yours the same way. The crew that shot me down is mine. Anna had no response to that logic. The American continued, wincing as she cleaned the burns. When I get home, people are going to ask me what the Germans were like. What you were like. What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them we were people. Same as you. Trying to survive a war we didn't start. The American thought about that. Every mission, every soldier I healed who went back to fight, we all kept it going. They sat in that understanding. The guilt too heavy to carry alone, too widespread to assign blame. I'm going to tell them you were kind, the American said finally. I'm going to tell them that's what defeated you. Your kindness. Because you couldn't keep fighting once you started seeing us. Anna wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Because he was right. The Reich had lost the war. The moment its nurses started documenting mercy. The moment its doctors started protecting records of extraordinary aiding care. The moment its medical corps decided that surviving the war meant preserving evidence of having remained human during it. You can't build an empire on hatred once your citizens have learned to love your enemy's humanity. 6 weeks later, American troops liberated the schoolhouse hospital. They arrived expecting resistance. They found German nurses standing at attention beside beds of Allied wounded, ready to transfer care. The American company commanders stared at the ward, at the captured Allied soldiers receiving the same treatment as German wounded, at the nurses who'd stayed to complete the handover instead of fleeing. Who's in charge here? He asked. All patients are stable. Full medical records are in the office. We've maintained Geneva protocols throughout. The commander looked at Oberst Fischer. Is this true? Better than Geneva protocols? Actually, these nurses exceeded minimum standards consistently. Because they're good nurses. That's what good nurses do. The commander assigned a military police unit to document the hospital. They expected to find evidence of war crimes. They found evidence of a revolution so quiet it had almost been invisible. They found Anna's hidden journal. She thought it would be used against her. Instead, a young American lieutenant sat in the former principal's office reading it, tears streaming down his face. My brother was in the Ardennes, essayit to Anna. I don't know where he was captured. I don't know if he survived, but I hope his voice broke. I hope someone like you found him. I hope someone wrote his name in a journal. I hope someone saw him. Anna gave him the British sergeant's mother's address. Write to her. Tell her you found evidence that her son mattered, that he was seen, that he wasn't alone. The lieutenant took the address, held it like a holy relic. I kept it because it was all I had left of who I used to be. Before I learned that the enemy says thank you. That address, that photograph of roses, that journal, they would all be filed in a military archive in 1946, marked as evidence of humanitarian treatment, referenced in Anna's commendation from the Allied military government. But more importantly, they would be markers, proof that transformation happened, that propaganda could be unlearned, that the distance between enemy and human could collapse in the space of a single thank you. The question Anna would spend the rest of her life answering was simple and impossible. If she could change, why couldn't everyone? What made her able to see what others refused to? And could mercy be taught, or only discovered in the terrible moment when you had to choose between the person you were taught to be and the person you could unhelp becoming? Anna's quiet revolution wasn't isolated. Across the collapsing Reich, in hospitals from Holland, Czechoslovakia, other German nurses were having the same awakening. Each believed she was alone. Each thought her mercy was a private betrayal. None knew they were part of a pattern. In Cologne, Nurse Margarete Weber was assigned to a hospital treating wounded from the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944, chaos, flooding through She'd been given clear orders. German wounded first, enemy wounded only if resources permitted. Resources never permitted. But on December 28th, an American medic was brought in alongside German casualties. He'd been captured while treating German wounded under fire. His captors, German soldiers, vouched for him. Said he'd saved 3 men. Said he deserved the same. Margarete treated him first. Not because of orders. Because of testimony. Because enemy soldiers with nothing to gain had told the truth about his courage. Why did you help them? She asked, while cleaning his wounds. Same reason you're helping me. It's the job. It's simple reduction cut through 3 years of propaganda. Not ideology, not strategy, not hatred or honor or any of the grand words that filled the radio broadcasts. Just, it's the job. Margarete would later testify that those 4 words changed everything. Made her realize she'd been overthinking mercy. That kindness didn't require justification beyond professional ethics. She treated 23 more Allied posts that winter. Documented each case meticulously. Made sure their names, their injuries, their outcomes were recorded in a ledger she hid under the hospital's foundation stones. When American troops found that ledger in April 1945, they discovered something unexpected. German wounded writing letters thanking the American medic for his care before he was captured. Enemy and ally collaborating on evidence of shared humanity. That ledger now sits in the National Archives. A physical impossibility. Proof of something that shouldn't have existed. In Munich, Nurse Helga Brandt faced a different revelation. She'd been assigned to a field hospital in January 1945, treating casualties from the Western Front. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were brutal, vengeful, would show no mercy to captured Germans. Then a transport arrived carrying German posts who'd been captured 3 months earlier. They were healthy, well-fed. Injuries properly healed. One soldier recognized Helga from before his capture. I thought I'd die in their camps, he told her. But they treated us better than we treated our own wounded. Why did they do that? After everything, Helga had no answer. She'd been told Americans were monsters, He was evidence they were better caregivers than the Reich. Not everyone welcomed this change. Not every nurse responded to contradictory evidence with transformation. Oberschwester Krieger in Hamburg refused to treat Allied wounded. She followed protocols exactly. Minimum care. No exceptions. When her hospital was investigated in 1946, Allied prosecutors found immaculate records of technical compliance with Geneva standards, but they also found mortality rates. Allied posts under her care died at 3 times the rate of those treated by nurses like Anna. Investigating Officer S. report noted. Cause of death often listed as natural deterioration or wounds incompatible with survival. Yet other hospitals with similar cases show significantly better outcomes. Recommend. Technical compliance is not the same as ethical compliance. Krieger was never charged with war crimes. She'd followed the letter of the law, but her reputation among medical professionals was destroyed. The nursing community remembered, kept its own records of who'd done the minimum and who'd done more. By 1950, Krieger was unemployed. No hospital would hire her, not because of legal sanction, because of professional judgment. The most dramatic example came from a hospital in Bremen. Nurse Katharina Schulz had been treating Allied wounded since November 1944. By March 1945, she was exhausted, disillusioned, questioning everything she'd believed about the war. Then an SS officer arrived to inspect the hospital. He found Allied posts receiving the same care as German soldiers. He found nurses treating them with respect. He found Katharina sitting beside a dying British soldier, holding his hand while he called for his mother. "This is unacceptable," the SS officer said. "He's dying. What does it matter who holds his hand? It matters because you're teaching him that Germans are weak, sentimental. When he returns home, he's not returning home. He'll be dead in an hour. Then he should die knowing German superiority, not experiencing German weakness." Katharina stood, faced the officer, made the choice that would define the rest of her life. "If mercy is weakness, then I choose to be weak." The officer arrested her. On the spot, charged her with undermining military morale, scheduled her for a disciplinary tribunal. The tribunal never happened. The war ended first, and when British investigators came to review her case, they found her hospital staff had documented everything. Every moment Katharina had shown mercy, every time she'd chosen the patient over the protocol. They also found the British soldier's medical record. Katharina had been wrong. He hadn't died. He'd survived. And he'd testified on her behalf. "She held my hand," he told the investigators. "In that moment, I knew the propaganda was wrong. If the enemy could be that kind, then we'd all been lied to about who deserved our hatred." For Kath, the price was her freedom for 3 weeks in March 1945. But the gain was immeasurable. She'd proven to herself that mercy mattered more than ideology. That kindness toward the dying wasn't weakness. It was the only strength that survived the war. These stories, Anna's, Margaretha's, Helga's, Katharinas, were documented independently, filed in different archives, referenced in different investigations. It wasn't until 1947 that a researcher at the International Red Cross noticed the pattern. Dozens of German nurses across multiple hospitals, making similar choices around the same time, all exceeding care requirements, all documenting their decisions, all preparing evidence for a future they weren't certain they'd survive to see. The researcher, Dr. Elisabeth Werner, wrote a confidential report for the Red Cross. This represents a form of resistance previously undocumented. Not political resistance, not military resistance. Humanitarian resistance. The systematic documentation of mercy as evidence against ideology. That report was classified until 1988. Too politically complicated for the post-war era, too nuanced for the narrative of Allied liberation and German guilt. But it existed. Proof that transformation happened, that propaganda could be unlearned through direct experience, that the distance between enemy and human could collapse bedside by bedside, patient by patient, thank you by thank you. Today, medical ethics courses use these cases as examples, not of extraordinary heroism, of normal human decency maintaining itself under pressure to abandon it. The lesson wasn't that these nurses were special, it was that they were ordinary. And ordinary people, given the choice between protocol and mercy, will sometimes choose mercy, even when mercy is expensive. Even when mercy is recorded as deviation. Even when mercy threatens everything they've been taught about who deserves their care. Because ultimately, the job is the job. And the job of a nurse is to see suffering and try to stop it. Not to ask first whether the suffering is in the right uniform. Not everyone in the German medical system welcomed this transformation. For every Anna Hoffmann exceeding care protocols, there were 10 medical staff who saw mercy toward enemies as betrayal. They had reasons. Legitimate ones. German soldiers were dying of treatable injuries because resources were scarce. German civilians were suffering because hospitals were overwhelmed. Every bandage given to a captured British soldier was a bandage denied to a German mother. This wasn't just ideology, it was arithmetic. Dr. Heinrich Brenth, chief surgeon at a field hospital in Lower Saxony, made this argument explicitly in a January 1945 memo to his staff. We face an ethical dilemma: limited morphine, limited blood, limited surgical hours. Every resource allocated to enemy prisoners extends their lives at the potential cost of our own people's lives. This is not a question of hatred. This is triage under conditions of absolute scarcity. He wasn't wrong. The German medical system was collapsing. Morphine production had fallen 60% since 1943. Blood supplies were critically low. Hospitals that had served 200 patients now held 600. In that context, treating the enemy wasn't just mercy. It was allocation. A choice with consequences. But what Dr. Brandt and others like him could unsee, or refused to see, was that the opposition to mercy came from the top down, not from resource limitations. S.A.C. Oswald Pohl, head of der Main Economic and Administrative Office, issued a directive in December 1944. The preservation of enemy lives serves the Reich only when those lives can be exploited for labor. Medical resources allocated beyond this standard represent theft from the German people, not rationing. Theft. This framing wasn't about resources. It was about ideology. About maintaining the distinction between deserving and undeserving suffering even as the Reich collapsed around them. The most vigorous opposition came from the Nazi Party's medical oversight committees. These weren't SS. They were party bureaucrats who'd been assigned to ensure medical professionals maintained ideological purity. In February 1945, one such committee investigated the hospital in Bavaria where Anna worked. They interviewed staff, reviewed records, noted troubling patterns of excessive care toward enemy prisoners. Their recommendation: transfer all nurses showing sympathy deviation to hospitals. Treating only German wounded, replace them with staff who understood proper allocation priorities. Oberarzt Fischer blocked the recommendation, used his Wehrmacht authority to override party directives, but he couldn't block everything. 3 nurses from Anna's hospital were transferred anyway, sent to facilities closer to the Eastern Front. For ideology still trumped humanity, where mercy was monitored and punished. One of those nurses, Schwester Ilse Becker, wrote to Anna in March 1945, "They watch us here. Count morphine doses. Question why we clean wounds thoroughly. Ask if we're being influenced by defeatist thinking. I miss your hospital. I miss being allowed to be a nurse." That letter never reached Anna. It was intercepted by censors, marked as evidence of ideological corruption, filed in Ilse's personnel record as proof she'd been compromised. Ilse would survive the war, but her nursing career ended in 1946 when that file was used to deny her license. The Allied investigators who reviewed her case concluded she was insufficiently resistant to Nazi ideology. The irony was savage. She'd been punished by the Nazis for being too merciful, then punished by the Allies for being insufficiently resistant. Caught between 2 judgments, both certain, both contradictory. But the opposition wasn't monolithic. Some people switched sides. Dr. Martin Weiss had been a true believer, party member since 1933. Published papers on racial hygiene in the 1930s, believed absolutely in the Reich's mission to purify humanity. He was assigned to a military hospital in Stuttgart in late 1944. Given the specific task of ensuring Allied prisoners received appropriate minimal care. For 3 months, he maintained standards ruthlessly, recorded every excess, reprimanded nurses who showed sympathy, filed reports on staff whose treatment of enemy wounded exceeded protocol. Then, in February 1945, a transport arrived carrying both German and American wounded from the same engagement. They'd been fighting over a bridge. The battle had been brutal. Both sides had taken casualties. The American patients were terrified. They'd heard stories about German medical treatment, about deliberate neglect, about doctors who let enemy wounded die. Dr. Weiss watched them watch him, saw himself through their eyes, saw the monster the propaganda had made him. He asked one American soldier, a lieutenant with severe abdominal wounds, "What have you been told about us? That you're animals. That you'll let me die slowly. That it would have been better to die on the battlefield than end up here. And do you believe this? Should I?" Dr. Weiss stood there, scalpel in hand, facing the question his ideology had never prepared him for. He could prove the propaganda right. Follow protocol. Provide minimum care. Let this soldier experience exactly what he feared. Or he could prove the propaganda wrong. Treat him like a human. Show him that not every German was the monster the Allies had been promised. He performed the surgery. 6 hours. Used resources he wasn't authorized to allocate. Gave postoperative care that exceeded protocol. The American survived. 2 weeks later, Dr. Weiss filed a report requesting revision of care standards for enemy prisoners. His justification: inadequate care creates martyrs. Adequate care creates witnesses to German medical ethics. It was strategic language, but the choice underneath was human. The SS rejected his recommendation, transferred him to a hospital farther from the front, filed a report questioning his ideological reliability. But something had changed. Dr. Weiss began documenting his cases differently, stopped writing reports about nurses exceeding protocol, started protecting their files instead. By April 1945, when his hospital was liberated, Allied investigators found his records showed a pattern. Mortality rates among enemy wounded had dropped significantly after February. Treatment standards had quietly improved. Resources had been reallocated in ways that suggested deliberate choice. Dr. Weiss was interrogated about this, asked if he'd been part of the underground resistance. "No," he said. "I was part of something simpler. I was a doctor who remembered I was a doctor." The turning point in the ideological battle came not from military defeat, but from medical reality. By March 1945, so many hospitals were treating mixed populations, German and Allied wounded in the same wards, that maintaining the fiction of separate standards became impossible. You could untreat the German soldier in bed 7 with maximum care and the American soldier in bed 8 with minimum care when they were 3 feet apart, watching each other, comparing their treatment. The ideology required abstraction, required distance, required the enemy to be somewhere else, not bleeding beside your own soldiers. When that distance collapsed, the ideology couldn't maintain itself. Nurses who'd been taught to see the enemy as subhuman found themselves making eye contact with wounded boys who looked exactly like the wounded boys in their own uniforms. Found themselves hearing "thank you" in English with the same gratitude as Danke schön in German. Found themselves unable to maintain a distinction that required blindness they no longer possessed. The opposition didn't end, but it lost ground daily. Not because of Allied military advances, because of accumulated moments where ideology met reality and reality won, where a thank you mattered more than a directive, where a photograph of roses made the enemy human, when Messe stopped being betrayal and started being the only thing worth preserving from the ruins. April 15th, 1945. The schoolhouse hospital in Bavaria. Anna was cataloging medical supplies when she heard the vehicles approaching. Not German engines. American. Told the 3 remaining German medical staff to prepare for handover. Her hands were shaking. Anna stepped forward, arms visible, empty. Schwester. Anna Hofmann. 23 patients. The company commander, Captain James Morrison, lowered his rifle slowly. He'd been briefed about potential medical crimes, about hospitals used for experiments, about the things the SS had done in the name of medicine. Allied wounded on the left. We've been treating patients. Yes, a British corporal spoke up. She saved my life, sir. Twice. Once from the wounds. Once from the infection. Gave me her own blood when they couldn't find a match. Morrison turned back to Anna. Why? Save the resources for your own soldiers. I'm a nurse. The American medics began examining patients, checking records, verifying treatment, looking for evidence of the crimes they've been trained to expect. They found something else instead. They found Anna's hidden journal, the one she'd kept since February, the one listing names, treatments, moments of mercy. They found Oberarzt Fischer's documentation system, the careful records showing which nurses exceeded protocol and when. They found letters, dozens of them, written by Allied posts to their families, describing their treatment, thanking unnamed German nurses for their care, asking their families to remember that not every enemy was cruel. Captain Morrison sat in the former principal's office, reading through the evidence, looking increasingly confused. This isn't what we expected to find. What did you expect? Negligence, deliberate harm. The things we've seen at other facilities. Those things happened, Anna said. I know they happened. I heard stories, but they didn't happen here. We wouldn't allow it. Even though your government ordered it. My government ordered many things. I didn't follow all of them. That's treason. Only if you lose. You won. So it's courage instead. Morrison smiled despite himself. You're remarkably calm for someone whose world just ended. My world ended in December when a British soldier thanked me. Everything since has just been epilogue. The American medics finished their examination. One approached Morrison with the German medical officer, Oberarzt Fischer. Sir, the treatment standards here exceed our field hospitals. These patients have received extraordinary care given the resource constraints. Morrison looked at Fischer. You organized this? These nurses organized it. I just protected the documentation. Because I'm 54 years old. I survived one war. I wasn't certain I'd survive this one. I wanted there to be evidence. Morrison ordered his men to secure the facility, but not as a detention center. As a functioning hospital. But until then, these patients still need care. You know them. You know their cases. Anna felt something crack inside her chest. Relief. Validation. That evening, an American military intelligence officer arrived, Lieutenant Sarah Cohen. She'd been assigned to investigate medical war crimes. This is remarkable, she said finally. You documented everything. So someone would know, so it wouldn't disappear. You thought it might. I thought if the worst happened, if I was charged with treason or shot for exceeding protocols, at least there'd be evidence that I tried. That I saw them. That they mattered. Lieutenant Cohen closed the journal carefully. My brother was captured in Belgium. I don't know what happened to him. Don't know if he's alive. But reading this. Her voice caught. Reading this makes me hope someone like you found him. Someone who wrote his name down. Who made him matter. For Anna. Address. The one the British sergeant had given Anna. My son returned home yesterday. He told me about you. About the photograph. About the morphine you gave him when you weren't supposed to. He said you saved his life twice. Once from his wounds. Once from believing he'd die among people who hated him. I don't have words for what you gave us, but I wanted you to know. My roses bloomed this spring. They're beautiful. He was right to show you. Anna read the telegram 3 times, cried the 4th time. Let herself feel what she'd been suppressing for months. The cost had been worth it. The boy lived. The roses bloomed. The mother knew her son had been seen. That evening, Captain Morrison called a formation. American troops. German medical staff. Allied patients who could stand. German wounded in their beds. I've reviewed the evidence, he said. I've interviewed patients. I've checked records. This facility maintained Geneva Convention standards throughout. The staff exceeded their obligations consistently. Schwester, Hoffman, and her team are cleared of any charges. He paused. In fact, I'm recommending them for commendation, for maintaining medical ethics under conditions designed to eliminate those ethics, for remembering what medicine means when everyone around them was forgetting. The Allied patients, the ones who could move, saluted Anna, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect from enemy to healer. Anna stood at attention, tears streaming down her face, understanding flooding through her. Not the ideological battle, but something harder and more important. She'd won the fight to remain human in a place specifically designed to make her abandon her humanity. That night, alone in the small room that had been her quarters for 3 months, Anna opened her journal one final time, added one last entry. April 17th, 1945. The war is over for us. The roses bloomed. That's all I need to know. That somewhere in England, roses bloomed, and a mother knows her son was seen. That Mercy survived. That thank you still means something. That we are remembered not for the uniform we wore, but for the choices we made when the uniform told us to stop being human. The British sergeant was right. We're all someone's son, someone's daughter, someone who grows roses, someone who needs to know they weren't alone. I wasn't a good German, but I was a good nurse. That will have to be enough. It would become evidence. Documentation. Proof of what happened when propaganda met a simple thank you and lost. But tonight it was just honest reminder to herself. You survived. You stayed human. You wrote their names. The liberation of Anna's hospital was repeated across Germany in April and May, 1945. Allied forces arriving at medical facilities expecting to find evidence of systematic abuse, finding instead nurses who'd exceeded protocols, doctors who'd protected records, staff who'd maintained mercy despite explicit orders to abandon it. It confused the narrative. The Nuremberg trials were preparing. Prosecutors needed evidence of German medical crimes. They had it in abundance from concentration camps, from SS medical experiments, from systematic brutality that defied comprehension. But they also had evidence like Anna's journal, like Oberst Fischer's protected files, like hospitals where enemy prisoners had survived at rates comparable to the Reich's own soldiers. This created a problem. How do you prosecute a medical system that both committed atrocities and protected mercy? The answer was to separate. To distinguish between SS medicine and Wehrmacht medicine, between ideological healthcare and traditional healthcare, between those who'd obeyed all orders and those who'd obeyed only some. By June 1945, Allied military governments began issuing what they called exculpatory documentation, certificates clearing German medical staff of war crimes. Charges. These weren't pardons. You can't be pardoned for crimes you didn't commit. They were acknowledgments. Anna received hers on June 23rd. A single sheet of paper, signed by an American colonel. She kept that paper in her medical bag for the rest of her life, next to the British sergeant's mother's address. What seemed like a personal vindication would eventually become a template. Over 500 German nurses and doctors received similar documentation between 1945 and 1947. Their files were used to prove that resistance to Nazi medical practices had existed within the system itself. This complicated the post-war narrative. People wanted clear categories. Germans who resisted versus Germans who collaborated. Heroes versus villains. Anna fit neither category cleanly. She'd served the Wehrmacht, worn the uniform, worked in the system. But she'd also subverted it, exceeded its requirements. Documented her rebellion in careful ink. The British government, reviewing her case in 1946, struggled with classification. Eventually they created a new category, Allied service under enemy authority. It was used for exactly 19 German medical workers who treated British prisoners exceptionally well. Anna was one of them. Remember the British corporal who'd said Anna saved his life twice? Remember his testimony? In 1947, he traveled to Bavaria, found Anna working at a civilian hospital in Munich. brought her a gift from his mother rosé cuttings. "She thought you might want to grow your own," he said, "from the same plant as the photograph, so you'll always remember that mercy blooms." Anna planted those roses outside her apartment, tended them carefully. They bloomed every spring until 1982, when Anna died at age 76. Her obituary in the Munich newspaper was small. It mentioned her wartime service. It mentioned the Allied commendation, but it focused on her post-war work, training young nurses, teaching medical ethics, insisting that the first rule of medicine wasn't do no harm. It was see the human first. The real heirs of this change were the nursing students she taught for 37 years, over 2,000 of them. Each required to read her journal, each required to understand that medical ethics don't have exception clauses. One student, Brigitte Schneider, interviewed Anna in 1979 for a medical ethics project. The interview was recorded. It's now in the German Medical History Archive. "Did you ever regret exceeding protocols?" Brigitte asked. "Every day," Anna replied. "Not because I exceeded them, because I had to decide whether to exceed them. Because the system made mercy a choice instead of a requirement. That's what I regret, that we lived in a world where kindness was deviation. But you chose deviation. I chose nursing. Real nursing. The kind that doesn't ask which uniform deserves the morphine. Would you do it again?" Knowing the risk, Anna was silent for a long moment. "Then, I would do it faster. I wasted weeks being afraid. Weeks where I could have helped more people but didn't, because I was calculating consequences. Fear is expensive. It costs lives. I wish I'd understood that sooner." Today, medical schools in Germany, Britain, and the United States use Anna's journal and ethics courses, not as an example of heroism, as an example of normal professional ethics, maintaining themselves under pressure. The lesson isn't that Anna was special. It's that ordinary people, when confronted with suffering, can choose to help despite orders to the contrary. That this choice is always available, always costly, always worth it. But the aftermath wasn't universally positive. Some of the nurses who'd exceeded protocols faced community judgment. In certain German towns, they were seen as traitors, people who'd helped the enemy while German soldiers died. Ilse Becker, the nurse who'd been transferred to the Eastern Front, never recovered professionally. She'd been documented as showing sympathy toward prisoners. That documentation followed her. In 1950s Germany, it was employment poison. She died in 1963, working in a factory, never nursed again. The cost of mercy was measured differently for different people. For Anna, it was validation and decades of teaching. For Ilse, it was professional destruction. The difference wasn't virtue, it was documentation, timing, and which Allied officer reviewed which file. Luck matters, even in mercy. In 1963, a researcher named Dr. Thomas Weber began compiling data on German medical staff who treated Allied prisoners during World War II. He wanted to understand the pattern, why some exceeded protocols while others didn't. He found something unexpected. It wasn't ideology that predicted mercy. It wasn't politics. It wasn't even personal history. It was professional identity. Nurses who identified primarily as nurses who saw their medical role as more fundamental than their national role were significantly more likely to exceed protocols. Those who identified primarily as Germans serving Germany were more likely to provide minimum care. The question wasn't, should I help the enemy? It was, am I a nurse who happens to be German, or a German who happens to be a nurse? Anna had answered that question clearly. She was a nurse. Always. First, fundamentally, the uniform was temporary. The oath was permanent. By 1970, this pattern was documented across multiple studies. Medical professionals with strong professional identity were more resistant to orders that contradicted professional ethics, regardless of nationality, regardless of war. This became foundational to modern medical ethics training. The idea that professional identity is protective, that identifying primarily as a healer makes you more resilient against orders to harm. Today, Medical students take ethics courses that explicitly teach this principle. They're told, you are a doctor first, a nurse first, a healer first. Your nationality, your employer, your government. These are secondary. When they conflict with your medical duty wins. That principle exists because of nurses like Anna. Because their documentation survived. Because someone recorded what happened when mercy met propaganda. The legacy isn't just historical. It's structural. It changed how medical professionals are trained to think about their obligations. The roses bloomed, and they keep blooming. In classrooms, in ethics codes, in the minds of medical students learning that the first question is which uniform deserves my care. The first question is there suffering I can help with? Everything else is secondary. December 1944. A field hospital, 15 kilometers behind the frozen Ardennes front. The smell of disinfectant mixing with pine smoke from a failing stove, into corner bandages stiffening in the cold air before nurses could finish unwrapping them. That moment, 81 years ago, set in motion something that still ripples through medical ethics. Education, worldwide, not a revolution. Not a dramatic resistance. Just a nurse choosing to give morphine to a wounded boy who said thank you. Just a doctor protecting documentation. Just ordinary people maintaining mercy when the system demanded they abandon it. This wasn't just about World War II. It wasn't just about German nurses and Allied soldiers. It was about the eternal question. What do you do when orders contradict conscience? Anna Hoffmann spent her life after the war answering that question in classrooms. She died in 1982. Her funeral was small. Family. Former students. The British corporal, now a retired school teacher, who'd traveled from England to pay respects. He brought a wreath made of roses. The same cultivar his mother had given Anna in 1947. He planted it on her grave. She gave me life twice, he told the gathered mourners. Once by treating my wounds. Once by showing me that the enemy was human. The first gift let me survive. The second gift let me live without hatred. I don't know which was more valuable. Oberars Fischer survived until 1979. He never spoke publicly about his documentation system. When pressed by historians, he'd say, "Only, I did what any reasonable person would do. I protected evidence that mercy existed. That's not heroism. That's archiving." His 3 filing cabinets, the ones that survived the bombing, are now in the German Federal Archives. Researchers access them regularly. Each file is a small story. Each documented choice is evidence of the space between orders and actions. Few know that Fischer's system was copied, that other Wehrmacht medical officers established similar documentation networks, that by early 1945, over 40 hospitals were maintaining shadow records, showing when and how staff exceeded care protocols. These records weren't coordinated. There was no resistance organization, no underground network, just individual officers making similar calculations. If we lose, someone will ask what we did. Let's make sure they can find the truth. That distributed documentation saved an estimated 200 medical professionals from war crimes prosecution. It provided evidence for Allied commendations. It proved that systematic resistance to ideological medicine existed within the German medical system. More importantly, it established a precedent. Medical professionals have a duty to document ethical compliance, even when doing so risks retaliation. Today, that precedent is codified in international medical law. Healthcare workers in conflict zones are trained to maintain records showing adherence to Geneva Convention standards, to document when they exceed minimum care requirements, to protect evidence of their ethical choices. This training exists because of people like Anna and Fischer, because their documentation survived and showed why it mattered. In a world where medical ethics face constant pressure from resource constraints, from political ideology, from military necessity, this story reminds us that the space between orders and actions is where conscience lives, that we always have more choices than the system wants us to believe. That mercy, even small mercy, even quiet mercy that leaves no witnesses except the suffering person, it helps that mercy accumulates, becomes pattern, becomes evidence, becomes legacy. The lesson wasn't just about opposing evil orders. It was that ordinary professional ethics, consistently maintained, are themselves a form of resistance. That doing your job well, treating all patients ethically, maintaining medical standards regardless of which uniform your patient wears, these aren't heroic acts. They're basic professional obligations. But in systems designed to eliminate ethical standards, maintaining those standards becomes revolutionary. In 2018, the International Committee of the Red Cross established the Anna Hoffman Award for medical professionals who maintain ethical standards under hostile conditions. It's given annually. Recipients are nurses and doctors from conflict zones worldwide who VE treated all patients equitably despite pressure to discriminate. The first recipient was Dr. Amira Hassan, a Syrian doctor who'd treated both Syrian military and opposition fighters during that country's civil war. She'd documented every case meticulously, protected records showing equal treatment standards, risked retaliation to maintain ethical compliance. "I read about Anna Hoffman in medical school," Dr. Hassan said in her acceptance speech. "I remember thinking, if she could maintain mercy during the Reich, I can maintain it during this war. If she could document her choices, I can document mine. Her example made it possible for me to stay human." That's the hidden story within the story. Not that Anna was extraordinary, that she proved ordinary people could maintain mercy systematically, could document it, could make it survive. Anna would later write, in a 1976 letter to a former student, "The hardest part wasn't exceeding protocols. It was believing that exceeding them mattered. That my small choices, extra morphine, a clean bandage, a photograph kept safe, would matter in the larger accounting. But they did matter. Not because they were large, because they were documented, because I wrote them down, because someone kept the evidence." Small choices accumulate. They become the historical record. They become what future generations learn about what we valued when everything else was chaos. The lesson wasn't just that individuals can resist ideology. It was that institutional structures matter. That documentation systems protect ethical choices. That when good people make humane decisions, someone needs to write it down. So it survives. So it becomes teachable. So it becomes a legacy. The British sergeant's mother, Elizabeth Hartley, died in 1968. In her will, she left specific instructions. To Rose, plant the one from the photograph. The one whose cuttings she'd sent to Anna was to be divided. Cuttings sent to the German Medical History Museum, to the nursing school where Anna taught, to the Imperial War Museum in London. So people remember will read that mercy bloomed even when the world said it shouldn't. Those roses still bloom. Genetic descendants of the plant in that 1942 photograph. Living proof that beauty survives horror, that growth continues despite destruction, that life insists on itself even in the most death-focused environments. In 2019, a researcher at Oxford University, Dr. James Chun, completed a comprehensive study of German medical personnel who'd treated Allied prisoners during World War II. He found 1,847 documented cases of care exceeding protocols. Of these, 342 resulted in Allied commendations. 89 resulted in German disciplinary action. 27 resulted in both. The fascinating finding, Dr. Chun wrote, isn't that some people maintained ethical standards, it's that so many did, systematically, while documenting their choices. They were preparing an archive of mercy, building evidence that would outlive the regime. This is resistance as revolution as documentation. That documentation now fills archives across 3 continents. Each file is a story. Each form is evidence. Each careful notation of exceeded care protocols is a small rebellion preserved in bureaucratic language. Together, they prove that mercy wasn't eliminated. It was driven underground, maintained quietly, protected carefully, and it survived. When the regime fell, the mercy surfaced. The documentation was declassified. The stories were told, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough for future medical students to learn that professional ethics can survive ideological pressure. Enough for future nurses to understand that documenting your ethical choices matters. Enough for future doctors to see that small acts of humanity, accumulated over time, become the evidence history uses to judge what mattered. The lesson of Anna Hoffman's story isn't that she was a hero. It's that she was a nurse who understood her job, who maintained her standards, who wrote things down, and that was enough. More than enough. It was revolutionary.